We have this basic calculator setup. We have defined a stack panel, which is going to stack all of the elements inside of it, one below the other. And we have defined label, text boxes, and a button. But currently, all we have is their basic definition without any values. In fact, the label even appears to be hidden or just not there because it has nothing inside. So during this lecture, we're going to start to define some values inside of these elements. So we change a little bit about how they look and a little bit about how they work. All the different types of elements, of course, being different, are going to have different kinds of properties. All of them will share certain properties like height and width and name, but each will behave differently. To the label, for example, we can define some content to be result. And by default, this is going to be displayed in the calculator before we execute any operation. The content is also going to be available, for example, for the button. Of course, both of these contents are going to be defined or working a little bit different on each of these values. When we define the content for the button, for example, to be calculate, it is going to be by default set to the middle, to be centered, contrary to the label, which is by default set to the left. The text boxes, for example, won't have some content, but they will have a text value, which by default I can set to 0. And notice that it will immediately appear inside of the designer. All of these changes are going to be automatically applied, but I want you to notice something else. The structure of how to define this is quite straightforward. You just write the name of the property, the equal sign, and inside of the double quotes, the value. Setting this is going to be fairly easy with the help of Visual Studio, because just like when defining new elements, defining new properties is going to give us some help from the auto-completion tool. The stack panel, for example, has a vertical alignment property that I can just start typing, select it from the list and type enter to be able to even see the values that we can set. So there will be some properties that can only have certain values. That is the case of vertical alignment, that can only be assigned to bottom, center, stretch, or top. Let's set this to center, for example, and notice how all of the elements inside of it are going to be vertically centered. If I do the same with horizontal alignment, they are also going to be centered together. And they are going to be defined to use as much space as they need. If, for example, the button instead of calculate have more text, it requires more space, hence the stack panel has to be wider. It is still horizontally aligned, but it requires a little bit more space. I can, however, change this definition a little bit because I don't like how this looks. It just doesn't look good to me, so I am going to delete the horizontal alignment. But I could set something like the margin. The margin is an interesting property because it will be receiving up to 4 values. If we set just one value, for example 10, the margin is going to be applied to all of the sides of this stack panel, to the left, the top, the right, and the bottom. If we define 2 values, for example 10 and 0, we don't see any changes right now, but there were some changes, believe me. The first value is going to be applied to the left and the right margin, and the second value is going to be applied to the top and the bottom margin. You can always define the 4 values. For example, 20 for the right margin and a 10 for the bottom margin. Notice how it did change this time. The first value then is going to be applied to the left margin, the second value to the top margin, the third one to the right margin, and the last one to the bottom margin. In this case, I'm going to leave the margin to be just 10, so I have this margin on all sides. But for example, for the label, I may want some margin to the bottom so it is separated from the next element, which is the text box. In that case, I can set the margin to be 0 for the left, 0 for the top, 0 for the right, and 10 for the bottom. And notice that the margin is immediately applied. The same thing can happen with the two text boxes that we have, and that is immediately applied on all of them. With this same syntax, we can be setting things like the background color for the button. And notice that this one also has a list of values that it can be using. Let's, for example, experiment with the Dodger blue color. It is now going to be the color of the button. And just like the background, we could set the foreground color, which I am going to be setting to white. And again, these values are going to be immediately changed. Now, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed on all of the different properties that are available in each of these elements. Like I mentioned before, you do not need to learn the values or the names for each and every one of them. You can always start typing something and search in the list with the help of Visual Studio what you are looking for. What I do want you to notice is the basic definition of these properties, the syntax. You can see how you write the name and the value. And according to the property that you're setting, you are going to want to change the type of the value. For example, with the colors, we see a list of colors that we can assign. With the margin, we have to pass 1, 2, or 4 values. With the text or the content, we simply pass a string. And by the way, with things like the height and the width, for example, in the window, we just pass a number. So hopefully you feel a little bit more comfortable working with these properties, knowing that as you grind, you have help from Visual Studio, knowing that as you set a value, you may also see if you have to set a certain value, for example, like in the case of vertical alignment. Hopefully now, before moving forward to the next lecture, where we are going to be working with the grid, you can now experiment with the values for these properties of the elements that we have in the layout. Maybe change colors, maybe change margins, maybe search for a new property that we haven't used in this lecture and see what they do. So I encourage you to experiment with these elements, start using new properties. And now in the next lecture, we're going to be working with a grid, which you will learn is a very powerful container that will allow us to define very accurate and very well structured layouts.